Okay, hello. So I wanted to make a video about income inequality, or that's what it's called. So I guess the difference between rich people and poor people, and the fact that, for example, you may have heard things like the poor are getting poorer as the rich are getting richer, which isn't completely true, but like there is a gap that's getting bigger. Again, a gap is misleading because it's a continuous spectrum between poor, middle, rich, depending on those terms are really ill-defined. I'll go into that. And you hear this term income distribution as well, which inherently is incredibly misleading to use the term distribution. That's one of the first things I want to talk about. But yeah, so that's what I'm going to try to cover a bit. Again, this is largely based on a guy called Thomas Sowell, who I think is just really brilliant. Especially, he's one of the kinds of people that explains concepts in a very simple, matter-of-fact way, gives lots of examples. I think his books and his articles that he's written, his interviews on YouTube are brilliant. But anyway, so let's start with this term distribution. The reason it's misleading is because it implies that there's a set amount of wealth or money that somehow gets, it's funny to me, arbitrarily distributed amongst people. Like someone chooses, for example, people may think rich people decide, oh, these people, they only need a little bit of money for that kind of a job, and these people will give lots of money and we'll keep lots for ourselves because we're greedy. It has nothing to do with that. So I want to give an example actually, and let's try to understand this concept. Maybe I'll just tell the point of this story first, which is that wealth or income, I should say, is not distributed. It is actually created. Okay, wealth is created and produced by people, in particular when they make exchanges. So actually, that's a good place to start. Anytime two people make a free trade between each other, okay, I'm going to give you $50 for that pair of shoes or whatever it is. Both people are making a choice that they think benefits them, and they're both correct. It's not a zero sum. This is one of the fallacies that seems to be really common. Thomas Sowell, again, a lot of this Thomas Sowell talks about in depth, and he's really, really good at it, explaining it. I think I'm gaining something, and you think you're gaining something, and it's not like a zero sum idea would be that whatever someone gains, someone else loses. That's true for some things, like for example stealing. But when people are free to make an exchange between each other, that's not the case. The person that's selling the shoes feels these $50 is worth more to me, and the person who's buying the shoes feels, well, those shoes are worth more to me than the $50. And you see both people gain, and there's wealth is created in that situation. I'll give another example, but and you would also say these people are going to haggle in theory. In fact, all of society is constantly sort of haggling and, negotiating these prices through their choices. The harshest way to sort of give feedback to a company is to choose whether to buy their stuff or not. And as soon as they face losses, they can't keep selling something that no one wants or at a price that no one's buying. So prices reflect the value of things in terms of what people are willing to pay. This is basic economics. So the example I'm going to give is two cities, and they're divided by a river, and they've never met each other. One of them has really beautiful fields. This is something I came up with. There's probably similar analogies, I think. But anyway, whatever. I'm just stressing. I'm going to keep going. I think this makes sense. One city has really nice fields, and they've got plenty of rainfall, and maybe they've been really good at agriculture for a long time and developed it. So they're really good at agriculture, but their home building skills are not as great. So their homes are a bit fall apart, buildings are not as sturdy, whatever, okay? In the other town, you have basically the opposite situation. Their fields are not that great. Their crops don't grow as well for whatever reason, various things, so they're not able to grow as much food as effectively. But they've got really good access to, I don't know, bricks, cement, whatever, wood, somehow, okay? This is just an analogy that could apply to lots of things. So they've got really good houses, really good structures, buildings that they make. But these two towns have never met each other. Now, let's say both towns spend about half of their effort on each thing, agriculture and building, just for simplicity. Then one day they meet each other, okay, and they set up, someone builds a bridge somehow, and they can meet each other across the river. And one town meets the other and says, oh, you got really good agriculture. And they're like, yeah, what, you don't have good agriculture? We can make more food. Maybe we'll make more food. We'll sell it to you because it's in their interest to sell, to do more, make more food and sell it if they can. Or especially if the other town realizes, oh, well, your houses aren't that good. We've got really good houses. Maybe we can help you build, and we can. So they end up trading. Okay. Now, instead of before you had both towns working equally on agriculture and building, now you've got a situation where the one town with the really good agriculture that they've developed and really good land for that kind of thing, doing only agriculture. They just focus on that, and the other town only focuses on building, and they build for each other, and they share the food among each other. So the trade will give you food, will give you building materials, or build stuff for you. The point is, there's no increase in work done. They're doing the exact same amount of work, but everyone has gained. Now both towns have both good food and good buildings. And the point is that wealth was created through the trade, okay? That was produced. It didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't a question of how should we divide this wealth. Every single time two people decide to make a trade, or if there's a business and they pay people to work for them and those people do work, they are creating wealth. And that wealth ends up being distributed equally in proportion to how much each person produces. The more you work, the more you get. The rarer your skill, the higher the demand is for it, and the lower the supply. If you're rare, like a sports player or something, movie star, doctor, anything, whatever's, a rare skill, you will get more money. It's not an arbitrary distribution. So distribution is incredibly misleading. Keep in mind, if society stopped doing everything, there would be nothing to distribute. As soon as some people started working, they would be getting all this income. Income really just means exchanging money and products between them, which they are producing, which wouldn't have existed if they didn't do work. So you have to understand that it is not arbitrary distribution. It is, wealth is produced by people that are doing work. Okay, so let's go into, there's these common comparisons using statistics of the rich versus the poor. A common one is, say, breaking things up into the top 20%, other 20% brackets, down to the bottom 20%. Now, I don't remember all of this off by heart, but there are some major issues with this. Okay, one assumption is this stuff stays the same over the time, that you have the rich and the poor. But the truth is, individuals do not stay in one group necessarily. Some do, potentially, but many move. The other thing is these divisions, and this is just something I want people to be aware of. I know some people might have already made their mind, that's it, they don't like it, but I want to explain a lot of this stuff, if that's okay. So for example, off the top of my head, the bottom 20%, some things Thomas Sowell found out about them, and they're casually referred to as poor people. Bottom 20% included things like 97% of them have either a VHS or a DVD player, which no one had in 1971, this is a comparison over time. I think most of them have air conditioning, which only about half of people had in 1971. I think maybe 70% or something own a car. 14% I think own 2 cars. This is the bottom 20%, right? What were some other examples? I forget, but it's not what would come to mind as your image of poor people. Another thing is, if you're looking at income, per year as a sort of way to decide rich people and poor people, there's some flaws with that. So for example, if you're looking at individual income, anyone who is a spouse of a rich person and chooses not to work, or only does a tiny bit of work, part-time, they're going to appear in the bottom 20%. They're not what you would think of. In fact, they'd be in the bottom, 5% probably, if they're not working at all. They're not what you would think of as a poor person. Anyone who owns a huge business, a multi-million-dollar business, if they have a year where they have a bad year, they lose a bit of money, or they make a loss or very little gain, practically stay the same, they're going to be in the bottom 20% as well. Not what you would think of as a poor person. Anyone who lives with their parents, young people who are just starting out in work, who have a big future ahead of them, if they're doing an internship, or I'm trying to think, people who, like someone who's going to be a doctor, but they're just starting out with consultations or certain types of things. They haven't built up their base of people that usually they refer to them. They may be in the bottom 20%. So you've got to be careful about assuming the bottom 20% represents poor people. Another example is the top 20%. Many people at one stage, if they sell their house, they may, for just that single year, end up being in the top 1% or so because their income for that year was $500,000 or 200 and something, whatever, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it can be a bit misleading. Another thing that people might have heard of in America is this apparent stagnation with household income, which is highly misleading. Like from, I don't know, let's say from the 70s until now or something like that, the growth in household income was only about 5% or 3%, something like that. And the point being that that's like, so there's no growth, there's no real economic growth, but it's highly misleading. If at the same time, it's very interesting. I want to see if people can work this out without just hearing it. But if you look at individual, like real income, so this is all adjusted for inflation, the growth has been something like 50% in the same period. So how can that be the case? So if you think about it, you might realize, well, maybe households are not the same size in terms of the number of people. And that's true. Because individual, earnings have gone up, people can afford to have their own house to more of a degree than they used to. The average number of people per house in America in that same period changed. It went from, I don't know what the numbers are, but it went down. That's what I understand. So it's like comparing apples and oranges. People's income have gone up a lot. So many cases where people would have, had a house together and shared can now move into their own houses. So the illusion becomes, the household income has stayed the same, but it's because there are less people in each of those houses and they've all become richer on average. So some other interesting things to keep in mind, like Thomas Sowell pointed out, he found 56% of all households will be in the top, I think 10%, he said, at some stage of their life. Okay? It's not like it's an exclusive club. No one can get there. That's more than half of everyone, or in America, I guess, in a certain period of time he looked at, of those households will be in the top 10% at some stage. I've heard a lot of other statistics. I'd have to double check them, but people in the top 20% don't stay there. Some of them move down, some of them go up. Some of the people in the bottom section move up. A lot of the ones from the bottom ended up in the top 20% after a period of 20 years. I think the main interval here was 1971 to 1996 or something like that, or 1991. So anyway, I hope I'm making a good point here of you cannot just look at broad statistics and think of this is the poor and this is the rich, because what you think of as poor, it might not really represent that. And the same with the rich, especially if it's done by year. A better way would be to take people, their average income over a period of 5 years or 10 years. And I think a lot of it you'll find evens out a bit. The gap will get a bit smaller. But that would be a better way to find people who are permanently poor or permanently rich. I think that's an interesting question. I don't know exactly. I don't feel I understand how do people become homeless and why do they stay homeless for periods of time. I think there's other things, like I think welfare creates incentives, less incentive to work. I also think, I just want to comment, I think there are these cliches that people have in their mind, or like stereotypes, and certain stereotypes seem to get more of an emphasis. Like if you look at, I tend to think all stereotypes have a certain element of truth, but for every group that you have, there's going to be positive ones and negative ones. If you look at like Nazi Germany, so they had these negative stereotypes about Jewish people that they promoted, but they only promoted negative aspects, all of which may have had some aspect of truth compared to other cultures, but they only focused on that. And then worse than that was the actions that they took. That's always the worst part. What your attitude is, how you see people, is not as bad as your actions. But my point was there's positives and negatives. So with poor people, we often get this, we think of these people that were just hardworking, that just want to get a job and they just can't get started. It's too difficult for them and they're just getting, pathetic pay for jobs that they get stuck in for their whole lives. And then you've got rich people who don't even need to do any work and they just stay rich. And I just think there may have been some truth to that, the sort of the toiling poor compared to the idle rich, like 100 years ago, 150 years ago. Some aspect of truth to that. Now I don't think it's as true, and it's good to keep in mind there are other equally valid cliches of slackers that are poor people that are just not choosing to work, that are just using welfare and getting benefits from that, making any excuses they can not to work, and people who are brilliant or really hardworking and have gotten good jobs. Like, so just be aware of rich doesn't mean good or bad, and poor doesn't mean good or bad. And again, there's no income distribution. It simply reflects how valuable have they been to society, how much have they produced and been rewarded for that. There may be other issues. Okay, but another thing I want to point out, there's this idea that the gap's getting bigger. So first off, like I say, gap, it's a continuum from poor to, again, these words are ill-defined because it's by income, and again, no income doesn't necessarily mean poor, and even high income, someone who has 12 kids and, you know, both parents work and they're just barely covering the costs of looking after all those kids, you wouldn't necessarily call them rich, even though their income may be quite decent. Like, I don't think people think about these things too much, and you really need to before you jump to conclusions. Actually, a comment I want to make is in science, we always focus on, we don't like to make things complicated. We are aware there are many factors, but we try to isolate a few factors or just certain things, control the other variables, keep them the same, and then measure those things, and we then make deductions, and we try to keep our conclusions as simple as possible and our models and explanations as simple as possible. And I strongly feel economics should be the same. But once you introduce politics wants to tell economics what to do or something. It all gets way too complicated, and they bring out in too many things, and it becomes too emotional, and you get all these images of like, this is represents the poor people and their struggle, and it's just becomes really complicated. But yeah, something really important that I think I actually understand, I can't believe I didn't think of this myself, is this idea of this gap getting bigger, or this spread between richest and poorest, is actually a really good thing if you understand what is actually happening. So don't want to spoil it. I'm going to go back. Let's say, and this is just a simplified model. It makes perfect sense to me though. Hundreds of years ago, okay, or even thousands of years ago, the main form of employment for humans, or the main thing, was agriculture. That was the big change from, again, I'm not an expert on human history, but you know, that was like the breakthrough thing that made civilization possible, I think a lot of people would argue. But because of that, it made sense that most people were in their prime, in their 20s or 30s or even younger. Men would have worked more than women, you would expect, at least for certain types of manual labor, and they may have been paid more. Children may have worked, but again, they might not have been paid as much as, you know, big burly men who were the most useful in those situations. But even back then, there may have been people whose other skills were useful, but overall, it was about labor. And so, your maximum pay would be in your 20s or 30s. Over time, though, as technology developed, we have higher skilled jobs, and the people who get paid the most tend to be a bit older, people in their 30s or 40s, who have been doing certain jobs for a longer time and have the skills and expertise. For example, once machines came in, manual labor is no longer as valuable. The difference between men and women in terms of productivity and usefulness diminishes for that reason. And similarly, like I said, age is no longer as important in a different way. Being young and healthy is not as important as being older and having experience and wisdom and knowledge of knowing what to do if something goes wrong, and having, just a wealth of memories and experience of things that have happened before that make you more reliable and better at certain jobs that pay more. So it's not surprising at all. Like, an interesting thing with this rich and poor 20% sort of dividing up, you find the demographic for the top 20% is much older. It tends to be people in their 40s, 50s. Compared to the bottom demographic, you get a lot of younger people. Not all of them are young, okay, but many of them are. And there's a tendency, most people throughout their life start somewhere lower and go higher and higher. And what this division really reflects is, as life expectancy is going up, as jobs become more about skill and about experience, and as the that value of that knowledge has become more and more valuable to people. So what's happening is, in the past, it used to be you just had your prime in your 20s, 30s, you get paid the most, then it just dipped. And then now it's more, you get paid a certain amount when you start, it goes up, 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 up. It peaks when you're in your 50s or 40s, maybe even 60s and 70s in the future. And then it's going to drop down, or you're going to retire, okay, at a certain point. So that gap is really between the same people. It's not between the rich and the poor, and their set groups. It's between people when they are older and experienced and people when they are younger and inexperienced. It's the same people, and it's a purely good thing. If the gap wasn't getting bigger, it would actually be a bad sign. It's something that you can actually predict if you think, just based on nothing else. Life expectancy going up, skills becoming more important, people living longer, working longer. You would expect a bigger gap between the people who are getting paid the most and the people who are getting paid the least. Again, I'm not saying this solves all the problems, but on the contrary, I find it incredibly annoying. I forget what his name is. There might be a Piketty guy, Thomas Piketty, with this book Capitalism, and it's like straight away, as soon as you mention things like income distribution, it's like, okay, you don't understand economics. If anyone says that, that's basic. It doesn't make any sense. As soon as you look at these broad statistics and say the rich, this is happening in the poor, there's a lot of implicit assumptions people have, that the same people are staying in the rich and the same people are staying in the poor. I don't know all the details, but I would be very interested to understand the degree to which they swap around. And it's not, you wouldn't expect people from the bottom 20% to just perfectly spread out between the rest. But the thing is, many of them move up. Some of them will stay there, but that you would expect that with anything. You're not going to expect random shuffling. You're going to expect people, God forbid, there are actually certain people, certain cultures, certain patterns of life where people work harder and ones where people are more lazy. The ones that work harder are going to tend to move up to the higher places, and others will stay near the bottom. But for the most part, people have a choice to work or not, or to try to develop unique skills. You cannot intuit discrimination or some kind of evil force, causing this distribution that's unfair. It makes no sense. You expect this distribution even in any circumstance. There's no reason for it to be flat. Anyway, so just I encourage people to be highly skeptical of these things. I'm just saying we can't make these assumptions. You can't say the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. By the way, the poor, I think I mentioned the poor have actually gotten sort of richer over time. The real income of the bottom 20% has gone up. And I gave those examples that Thomas Sowell pointed out in the book Economic Facts and Fallacies. He has a bunch of classic books. Even Basic Economics is really good. I haven't listened to all of that one yet. I'm listening to audiobooks. But anyway, I hope that makes sense. Just again, stressing, I'm saying we don't know exactly. You can't make comments. You can't say, oh, bad things are happening, the government needs to interfere. I'm just saying this is actually good science. It's not, nothing bad is happening here. And if you want to make these statements that the rich, controlling, you need to do much more careful analysis and take all of these things into account. And it's just frustratingly, insultingly stupid that apparently some of these people don't do that. So anyway, I'll leave it there. I'm making some other videos as well. So, okay, bye.